The exhibition explores the relationship between Exeter, the city of Exeter, and RAMM's collections with the transatlantic slave trade in the 18th century. And it's a way of looking at that massive global history on a very local level, a kind of hyper-local level. So the exhibition is intended to do that, to connect local stories with a big international story. The starting point for the exhibition actually came in 2018 when we loaned the Portrait of an African, which is one of the most famous paintings in RAMM's collections, to an exhibition in Brazil about the Atlantic world. And at that stage we thought, well, we loaned this work to many institutions, but we'd never really done an exhibition about the Atlantic world, the Atlantic slave trade and its impact and effects in Exeter and Devon, and particularly its ties with RAMM. So that became a fantastic kind of starting point to develop the rest of the content of the show. The fascinating thing about the Portrait of an African is, of course, we don't actually know who the sitter is after lots of different interpretations. And in the end, we invited a group of people with a kind of interest in the portrait to express their responses and emotions to it. We understood right from the outset that this is not a project that was for RAMM alone to take on board. So we brought together a group who discussed the issues of an exhibition like this. They looked at some of the collections, they talked about ways in which we could express some of the feelings that they held about the transatlantic slave trade and their histories as people descended from enslaved Africans. And that was a really important part of forming an idea that we could then turn into a gallery exhibition. To start the process, the panel talked to the curators, they looked at objects in store, they looked at the ethnographic collections, and I think that was a really important process for them to understand an institution like RAMM with its history, what our collections are like, and to be given access to them at that kind of very personal level.
I thought it was important to take part in the process because it's allowing hidden stories about Devon and Devon's past and its involvement and its links directly to me and to the history of the local area. And I wanted our voices to be heard and represented and our opinions and ideas taken into consideration.
We decided that it would be a good idea to work with a contemporary artist to engage with the themes and ideas in the exhibition. And we invited a number of artists to suggest ways of working with RAMM, and with John Seeley and my colleague Julian Parsons, we selected Joy because she came up with a really engaging way of working directly with the collections here at RAMM and with people in the community in Exeter and Devon.
I think the exhibition being here at RAMM but also being in Exeter brings home the fact that the whole of England actually benefited from the transatlantic slave, and I think often when we think about it, we think about Liverpool, we think about Bristol, we think about London. We never think about the other parts of the country, and I think Exeter is an example of a thing, how people benefited across the whole of the UK from this, and I think that's why this exhibition is so important, that people then associate it with being outside of that triangle that has been constantly in our minds. Our textile, the influence of textile came from the objects in the museum because I was given unfettered access to the collection, both the things on display and the things in storage. One of the objects that I looked at in the store was the Cumsacheville Textile, and I was really taken by its form, but also there was an image of a little black person holding up a parasol over a grand lady, obviously out for a walk in a park or something. And I just thought, I want to make a piece of work that actually has a conversation with that particular work. So that work was in 1700, this is in 2022. So we're looking at the 18th century and we're looking at the 21st century. So it's all these hundreds of years apart, and using a similar form of production. That is hand sewn, which represents the idea of time. So people having time being around luxury, but the time that the enslaved didn't have, because their time didn't belong to them. And then so with mine, I worked with cyanotype to make the print. So that side of the production, which I've done by hand, is sort of the same as their embroidery, like having time, but not really having time, because the purpose is to make this piece of work. But the embroidery is actually all machine embroidered, which then talks to the idea of industry and also mechanisation, which is a sign of the age in which we live now, but also about us not having that time to sit and luxuriate in the making of something. When I first arrived to think about the commission, I was really interested in doing something around sugar, and I think I was fascinated by the idea of a sugar loaf, because it's something that's not really within the language now. But when I think about something like Sugarloaf Mountain, which actually looks like a sugar loaf, and you don't really think, well, where did that, and why have they called it a sugar loaf, and what is a sugar loaf? And then to actually see those cones and those vessels and see a replica of a sugar loaf, for me was like, that's what I want to focus on. So I knew right at the beginning I wanted to focus on sugar, and then but to use sugar as a vehicle to tell the story of the transatlantic trade.
We know about that from about the 1680s in Topsham, and even maybe a bit earlier in Exeter, maybe 1650, that there were sugar refining houses, as they call it, sugar houses. The one in Topsham is quite well known, from about 1684, run by Samuel Buttle and then his family, who had plantations out in the States and in Barbados. So all that, the sugar was grown there, harvested there, all through enslaved labour. And then that raw sugar was brought to Topsham. And we know that there was a sugar house, not just through the documents, because there is plenty of archaeological evidence, so bits of pottery like this. And these relate to replicas that we've got here. This is what you might say is the raw material for refining sugar. You essentially have a mould that you're pouring your unrefined sugar into. It drains into this syrup pot, and you're left with the kind of a crust of sugar in here that you then actually refine and whiten by pouring white clay through it, the same sort of clay that you use to make clay pipes. And at the end of it, you're left with a sugar loaf, which is essentially the same shape as the mould of your refined sugar. And that was the valuable product. You're increasing the value of this sugar many, many times over by refining it in Topsham or in Exeter.
These are all objects from RAMM's collections connected with the trade in sugar. So obviously very fine silverware was traded in Exeter, and it was a golden age for goldsmiths in Exeter, with sugar casters, hot chocolate using sugar, coffee using sugar, tea using sugar. And so these are some examples from the collections. But equally, coffee houses such as Mole's Coffee House, which is in Exeter as well, are places where these imported goods such as tea and coffee and chocolate would be enjoyed, possibly with rum from the sugar trade, possibly with tobacco from the Virginia tobacco fields. So the economy around enslaved people, around the slave trade, is very visibly evident in the objects that we have here.
Henry Townsend was an Exeter-born missionary who was sent to Sierra Leone in 1836 at the age of 21. And he travelled with a small group of Yoruba into what we call today Nigeria, up into the town of Abeokuta. And Abeokuta means refuge among rocks. It was a place of safety for people who escaped persecution and wars, and he became the British presence there for almost 40 years. Townsend is relevant to RAMM because he donated a number of items in 1868. One of the items shown in plain sight is this Oboni sword, along with a number of other items such as the indigo-dyed cotton drawstring trousers that would be seen under a Muslim man's robe, and other items such as the war drum that he had acquired in 1864. This wooden war drum would have been used in the dances and songs of the women warriors, the prestigious battle force of the King of Dahomey were these warrior women, these fierce warrior women.
We wanted to draw attention to the resistance and rebellions that took place, and how there were so many that we couldn't put them all on the timeline where we've put significant dates, so we've created a map that just shows the dates of all the uprisings, expressions of resistance that took place. From 1730, Britain was the biggest slave trading country involved in transatlantic slave trade. And it wasn't a straightforward trade triangle, but as this map shows, there were many goods that were moving to and fro, and it created an enormous amount of wealth.
The conservation team here at RAMM is responsible for the care of all the objects at RAMM, both on display and in storage. The bird was collected by William Devon, who was RAMM's first curator. He is part of the stories we tell in plain sight because he inherited a plantation in the Caribbean.
William Devon's interests were really broad. He was interested in archaeology but also in natural history. He joined RAMM in 1865 and he was responsible for organising the first exhibitions and also cataloguing the collections. These two small butterflies were collected by William when he accompanied his father back to South Africa in 1860. These two butterflies are a species that was new to European science. And these three birds here are all ones that he collected in and around the Topsham area.
In order to bring abolition, huge amounts of compensation were paid to people who had been involved in plantations. And so this bit of the exhibition allows you to see where we've got the database that covers the compensation records that were recently digitised, and so people can find out a lot more about this history now. The legacy of transatlantic slave trade obviously is still alive today, and we've worked with some of our local community who've very kindly given us their thoughts and their responses, their reflections on the transatlantic slave trade, what it means to them and what the exhibition has stimulated. So those thoughts are recorded in a short film which is also here in the exhibition and on the website.